Okay, this presentation on communication skills in environmental science is aimed at fellow environmental science students to inform about the challenges and opportunities in environmental science communication. Never has communication in the sciences been so critical, and never has evidence-based science communication been so challenged and challenging. Evidence-based research is constantly being undermined, attacked by vested political and corporate interests, and by the spread of insidious misinformation. For environmental science, this is an age of crisis, the Anthropocene. Never has effective communication in the sciences been so critical. Researchers are expressing unprecedented frustration, even outright despair at the failure of scientific messaging on the environmental and climate emergency. Literature in the field is reflecting this communication crisis and demonstrates just how important effective communication skills are in the field of environmental sciences. Why is communication important? It's important to share the knowledge, to share the results of evidence-based research. Transparency. Often that research is publicly funded and therefore it should be public information. Our traditional channel for doing that is journal articles, press releases. That knowledge, that communication is important to influence decision makers and public policy. It can also change behaviour and empower citizens. Communication is important in creating connection, partly because in order to create effective communications, we might need to create connections between multidisciplinary academic teams as well. It's also important that we're aiming to create connection between our audience and the topic about which we're communicating. It's important that we're adept in a digital, fast-moving information environment and can use digital media to support sharing knowledge in an effective way without causing unexpected adverse effects. It's important that we use our communication to challenge misinformation, untruths, and fake news. What is good communication? Essentially, good communication is simple, clear messages, repeated often, amplified by a variety of trusted and caring messengers. In other words, our communication should be shareable. Just by way of an example, this is from the Centre for Climate Change Communication. 5 key facts about global warming in 10 words. It's real. It's us. Experts agree. It's bad. There's hope. Science communication can motivate people to engage in additional information seeking and learning, which is especially beneficial when the issue at hand is complex and when adaptive management strategies are necessary. Sometimes referred to as broaden and build approach, communication that creates interest, curiosity, understanding, and perhaps even awe can lead to additional information seeking, exploration, learning, and understanding, ultimately helping people to apply their knowledge and become more capable of coping with difficult and unfamiliar situations. So what do we need to create these effective communication messages? Multidisciplinary teams. So you need content expertise, so that could be your environmental science team, but you also need insights from the social sciences to build good communications. So that can be insights into audience research, insights into the psychology of how people are interpreting the messages. You also need input from communication specialists, and that could be marketing, public relations, journalism experts. I'd suggest you also need to take on board feedback from the 4th member of your team, which is your audience. Creating connection. The literature suggests there is an overwhelming need for innovation and interconnection. And that connection begins with those multidisciplinary teams to create effective messages. It's important to share experiences on a personal level to connect, listen to audiences and respond accordingly, be culturally aware, sensitive and responsive, and to be reflective in our engagement. It's important to build trusted allies across academic disciplines and groups and individuals in society, community groups, civic organisations, citizen science projects, even corporates are potential allies in delivering messages. So it's important to develop trust and connection. Oops, where did that go? Okay, why is the big one. Misinformation, untruths, fake news, that's what we're dealing with. Vested interests, the tobacco industry began this process. In fact, some of the same players that worked for the tobacco industry are now working for fossil fuel companies, and these guys are really good at what they do. They are raising the spectre of doubt about established facts. They're directing media towards false balance coverage. It's eroding trust and it undermines evidence-based public policy. It's currently happening at a scale and level of complexity never before witnessed, and it's altering the nature of public debate. It's sowing the seeds of cultural and political polarisation, and it's making meaningful legislative action nearly impossible. So how do we deal with it? Taking on board social science insights is one tool we can use. Things like cultural cognition is how people process messages, and it's important that we're aware of things like that as we're creating messages. One tool that's suggested in the literature is that we start to use attitudinal inoculation, which is where we provide a dose of the refuted argument before our audience hears it elsewhere. It warns them that misinformation is likely to be coming, and it arms them with a counter argument before they actually hit it. As part of that, we're also drawing attention to the sources of misinformation and their economic and ideological motivation. As part of our engagement with the community, we're also working to improve the image of scientists, so that constant engagement with the public through digital channels like blogs, Insta, Threads, what used to be Twitter and is now X, if anyone's still using it. There's also legal and political strategies we can use, but we don't really have time to discuss that. Okay, on to digital media and social media. A lot of the literature suggests that every expert, including students, should be using it now. And as part of that process, the literature also suggests students should be working to build their own multidisciplinary communication teams. Using social media costs nothing. It allows you to test metaphors and visuals for their effectiveness. It lets you repeat your messaging. It lets you amplify research. It is a fantastic platform to challenge misinformation. It gives you great audience reach, and you can be a science influencer. Now, just by way of one very small example, this is a fairly standard Instagram post from Jane Goodall. It's really basic, simple quote tile. So many living creatures have feelings, no loss, suffer pain. We must understand the mutual dependence between humans and animals. Now, this is a good example of creating connection. So Goodall's creating connection between herself and her audience, which is public, but she's also in this message trying to create connection between her audience and the natural world. It lets her test that message. She has a comment section which provides her with feedback. Good example of where things can go wrong if you're not careful, especially in a time of crisis. It's really important to be aware of how you frame your messages. It's important not to inadvertently make things worse. During COVID, there are examples where messaging about nature kind of backfired. You've got to frame that messaging carefully. You have to frame nature as the solution, not the problem. There's one example of a tweet, and about the only thing that people really heard was huge number of viruses exist in the natural world that threaten us. They didn't get that it's how we're engaging with the natural world that's really causing that threat to us. Another example of communicating about bats. This is a pretty good one. Another group I follow, Bat Conservation Rescue Queensland, these guys will always include some kind of statement that reinforces the importance of bats to our ecosystem. They're a keystone species in Australia and we can't live without them. So for example, first off, that's an image it's hard not to empathise with. Baby bat, who's not going to feel for that? But these guys always mention the ecological role of bats, and in this post they've said he's now flying free, performing his important ecological role of pollination and seed dispersal. Now these guys also don't overlook the public health issue, and they'll always say don't touch the bat if you find an injured bat. But they don't over-egg it, they don't make people afraid. I just want to conclude with one of the finest and most important communicators in the environmental sciences, and that's Rachel Carson. As environmental science communicators, we would all do well to emulate her lead and attempt to make the most complex science accessible to everyone. There are a million quotes from Carson I could have used. I just pulled this one because I like that it's about making science something that everybody needs to understand. So this notion that science is something that belongs in a separate compartment of its own, apart from everyday life, is one that I should like to challenge. We live in a scientific age, yet we assume that knowledge of science is the prerogative of only a small number of human beings, isolated and priest-like in their laboratories. This is not true. It cannot be true. The materials of science are the materials of life itself. Science is part of the reality of living. It is the what, the how, and the why of everything in our experience. It is impossible to understand man without understanding his environment and the forces that have moulded him physically and mentally. I would argue that our job is to share that scientific knowledge to make it accessible to everyone. Thank you.